Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at a kind of nifty gun. This is the FN Five-Seven. It shoots the somewhat proprietary 5.7 ammo. It is the counterpart to the P90 or PS90 rifle, which shoots the same round. The idea was to make a round halfway between a rifle and a pistol and make a nice carbine bullpup sized rifle with a massive capacity, 50 round magazines, and a pistol that takes the same ammo. So it's a pistol that packs an awful lot of punch for a pistol. It is a 5.7 millimeter round. It's not particularly large. It's 22 in size ish, but with a significant powder charge. But it gives both the pistol and the rifle humongous capacity, and one round for both. So, a little dusty here. I apologize. This guy's been sitting on the rack for a while. Let's take her down. Part of the reason I want to do this one is because this is a gun that is very, very easy to destroy a couple of the parts, and the company is really grumpy about replacing them. They were openly hostile to me when I had actually called them on the phone at one point, needing a replacement. Oops. Magazine safety. So to take it down, this lever here is the actual takedown lever, and you pull it back just a little bit, pull back on the slide, that is, and then you'll be able to, with some effort, get that into the rear position, and when you get it all the way to the rear, then the slide comes forward an extra tiny bit and right off. And basically, this gun is a lot of metal encased in polymer. And so I set the frame aside and dig into the slide, and that's kind of the first thing that you'll see is you've got this polymer outside, but inside is an entire metal firearm, essentially. The spring and barrel, you're going to push forward just a little bit to lift it up and out. And we're not going to actually disassemble this barrel and recoil spring assembly. Mainly because you have to take off this snap ring there, and if you don't have a replacement one, those are just a bad idea to take them off. So unless I were actually going to replace that spring, I would not be taking it apart. That's the story with that. So we're just going to leave that as a complete assembly. There is a firing pin safety. So this is striker safety, striker fired gun. This is our striker up here, and unless we push down on said firing pin safety, whoops. Let's see if I can do that where everyone can actually see it. Push down on that, then the striker can come forward far enough to actually give us firing pin protrusion. So without that button pushed, firing pin doesn't come all the way forward. With it pushed, you can see the firing pin nose its way on out. What you're going to see here with these pins is they're very difficult to work with, and they're designed to lodge into the polymer. So there is a side, one side of these pins is going to have serrations in it, and the other side will not. The serrated side bites into the plastic, and so when you're taking them in and out, you want to come out on the side. You don't want to drive the serrations through the gun. And if I'm not mistaken, usually if you peek at your gun, you can tell which side has the serrations. And unfortunately, it's been long enough but I can't tell anymore. I think it comes out to the left. If not, then you'll get to watch me screw up mine, and you won't have to screw up yours. So let's give this guy a good solid tap and see if I got it right. And survey says no serrations on that side, which means I probably got it wrong. So my choices are to either reverse direction or to see how hard is that pin in there. Let's try in reverse direction and make sure that we're doing this the smartest way that we can. It's also possible that I put it together wrong last time and had the same discussion inside my head of should it go out to the left or the right, and just got it wrong. So what you can see going out this side is those are the serrations in the pin, and they are wider than the pin, so you don't want to drive those through the metal. It'll rip them right off. In all likelihood, the very first time I did this, I did not expect those, and I made a bloody mess of the thing. So I'm pretty sure when I put this back in that I'm going to be clever and go in from the correct side, so that the serrations are consistently on the left side of the gun. I think that'll just make my life easier. All right. So with that out, we now should be able to think through what else is holding it. Now, if you notice, the metal comes through the polymer at the front, which means when we do get it loose, the back will be what's lifting off towards the front of the gun. And I'm trying to remember if there's another retaining pin or not. There's a hole where the sight is there. Oh, no, that's what it is. That's so you can just push on it. So yes, once you've driven that single pin out, now the inner steel frame will lift out, and then again, as long as you unhook it from the front. Whoops. Our sight, of course. Got to clear the sight. And now we have a metal gun on the inside of a hollow plastic shell. And now we can see all manner of just what the hell kind of were they thinking. And it's not quite as crazy as it might seem. And we'll show you how it breaks down. So this pin is your extractor. So if I take off some of the pressure, I can just lift this pin out. That's a nice design element. And this itty bitty extractor with a gigantic freaking spring. So unlike extractors where there's just a lot of steel to them, so physics can do some of the job, that's not what's going on. In this one, it's all about that huge spring providing all of the inward force so that it holds onto that rim for dear life. And now we can see this pin, which actually drifts left and right fairly easily, is what's keeping the striker from coming any further back. So the striker, it's going to basically bottom out in this pin, and at the same time we can now see the top of the firing pin safety, and it's got a little spring that actually goes into, or up against, I should say anyway. I'm not sure there's an actual hole for it there, but we'll see in a second, in the sight itself. So I'm going to keep a thumb over that guy, and when we push this pin out, our striker's going to come shooting out. And this pin is again not under a ton of pressure, so as I pull it out, I'm going to make sure I don't let the striker go flying. And it didn't go flying, so it's not under a ton of extra pressure here. Actually, is there one more retaining pin for that guy? No, striker should be free at this point. Let's see. What else retains the striker? Obviously, I'm a little befuddled here. I would have thought that once we were clear of the firing pin safety, that this guy would just pop out for us. Do they want us to actually knock the sight out? That would kind of suck. I'm hoping... Ah, yes. a little gentle push got us through and slipped us off. So looking at how that was in there, I'm not quite sure exactly what it was hung up on. I would have expected to have pushed the firing pin safety in a little bit more normally. It seems to go in... Yeah, there's just a tiny ridge in here somewhere that's hard to see, that it kind of bumps past. And so there's no real retention mechanism here. Once you've got the cross pin out, just a little bit of pressure and you'll be able to pop the striker and it spring out. And so the only thing, if we wanted to disassemble and actually get the entire firing pin safety out, I think we would have to take the sight off for that. And I don't happen to have that Allen key here to loosen that, and nor do I have an appropriate sight tool. So we're just going to leave the firing pin safety in place. You can see that what's going on there is this piece of metal is actually what's being moved when the safety is pushed. That metal is pushed out of the way, and if we look at the underside of the firing pin, what we see is a little shelf here where that piece of metal is sitting. So when the firing pin safety gets pushed up, it lifts. Let's use something that's squarer. So sits like this, you push the safety so it's safe, and now it can slide past it. And if you notice, this is one of those well-designed ones. This is not a 90-degree angle. It doesn't come straight up like this. It actually goes in a few degrees, and that way it's gonna, if the safety is only partially pushed, it's gonna hook onto that and pull the safety right back down and keep it in the safe position. And so that's it for the slide. When the barrel is in there, it seats into the metal. It's got this bearing, which is going to keep it centered in there, and then just a little bit of spring pressure to pop it in there. And so one of the things about this is it's not a tilting barrel design. That barrel is just going to move straight back and forth, and that means that there's probably threaded versions of this for suppressors, and you don't have to get the Nielsen device. The knuckle. Anyway, so we're going to put this guy back together, same way we took him apart. I'm going to slide this guy in. Remember, there's a little boop, push him past that point. Cross member goes in, and we're going to have to push him in just a little bit to get that guy to go. And the cross member just sits there. It's going to center itself in the plastic shell. And then for the extractor, spring goes back in. It's got a nice little hole for it, and you can see how far it sticks out. That's a big old spring. And then we're going to sit this guy down there. And we're going to get some light in on the end so we can see, push it in with our thumb, and sink it right through. And that's it. Just make sure that that's pushed all the way in, and it will not protrude past this big machined, or not even machined, it's welded. So this is actually two pieces of steel. There's what was probably... this outer shell might have even been stamped from the looks of it. It's just a really thick piece of stamped steel, so it's bent around this angle, and then the front piece welded in, and then this whole firing pin encasement welded in as well. Interesting design. Remember, this is much thicker barrel than on 22s, especially the chamber. I mean, the whole thing. I mean, a 22 is normally just a thin steel sleeve. This is a far higher pressure round, so this is a substantial amount of barrel to keep all that retained. To get it all back together, we're just gonna make sure everything's more or less centered, and we gotta remember that the sight's gotta make it up through there. So I'm trying to make sure there's a little bit of room for everything that needs to have room. Get that going on the front. That piece is still centered on the back. And now we're back together. And like I said, I think for consistency, I'm going to try and put the serrated edge on the left side. Let me just check. Yeah, based on how worn down these serrations are, I think I just gorilla'd it all the way through once in its life, which is just bad juju, you know. So don't make that mistake. Pay attention to which side the serrations are on, and remember that there's a finite number of times you can do this, because you are stretching that plastic out just a little bit each time. That's it, and that's our upper back together. Go ahead and throw the barrel in. Well, I might need the barrel for a demonstration later. So let's switch over to the frame, and this is where things get hairy. So when we're looking at this, it's important to realize that not all of these pins are created equal. This pin has those serrations around it. This pin has the serrations. Relatively sure this one does too. These do not. And these are actually retained by a very different mechanism. There is a spring in here. If you can see that spring lying between this piece of metal and this piece of metal, it's barely thicker than a hair. I mean, it's tiny. And if you don't know that it's there, it's going to cause you all manner of hurt, because it is retaining. It's in a groove in this pin, and there's another tail leg of it way back there. It's retaining this pin. So this little spring, if you're not paying attention and you just hit these, you will destroy that spring with one hit, and then it's pretty much game over. And like I said, they're really grumpy about sending replacements. So let's take a look at some of the mechanisms here so we can see what's going on before we get into it. Let's see. This big old spring is what's pushing up on the locking mechanism here, the takedown mechanism. And so when that's forward, it just prevents these from going down. When it's back, it not only leaves them clearance to go down, but also holds them down so that you can get the slide off past them. This pin here, let me grab my barrel again. This pin here is what the barrel actually sits on. And the other thing, let's see what's going on. Yeah, so that's the lockup position, and so it's designed to have some room to have it go back so that those lugs can be dropped down, and then even, cammed down some more beyond that, and then that just keeps everything pushed forward. And so that's that. The safety in this case is a trigger blocking safety. That's why it's way up front. This is one of the, relatively speaking, shortcomings of it. You can operate it with the forefinger. is, I guess, it's designed because normally, a safety back here where your thumb would operate it, the only thing back here is the actual slide lock. So ambidextrous, if you're left-handed, you got it there too. I guess technically, if you had a good grip here, you could thumb your safety on and off with your weak hand. But yeah, that's what it's doing. Is it's a trigger block. So the trigger, this middle piece of the safety here, it's only on the top half, not on the bottom. So the trigger actually is moving and sliding underneath this bar. But when this is up, that round top part just rolled into the way of the trigger. So we can't actually move the trigger. The hammer, I referred to this as a striker-fired gun, and it's not. I apologize. Because that thing looks so much like a striker under normal circumstances, I called it that, and that's just wrong. This is a firing pin. The hammer is going to come up and hit it, and inertia is going to carry it forward to do its thing. It really doesn't get much surface to hit it on. It's going to hit it really hard. I think we can illustrate that. Let's see. I'm not sure if this... I don't think this one actually hurts it to drop. It does have a magazine safety in there as well. So when we... Let's see if we can spot the magazine safety. As we're putting in our magazine, we get to... Let's see. So the trigger bar is not all the way up right now. So if we operate the trigger bar doesn't actually come up above the line of the frame. Once the magazine is in there, now the trigger bar is just a little bit higher, and when we actually go to pull it, and it's actually popped all the way up. So without the magazine, that's not there. So the magazine safety, that's how that works. There's going to be a shelf in there where it interacts with probably one of these lugs down there, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe. Let's see. Get some light in there. Maybe we can figure it out. The magazine sits up there. No, actually, it's this surface here. This surface here is going to come up and hit, sorry about that, hit this bar and lift it up. So this is a little spring here, and it's going to lift it up, and that's going to let the trigger come up when we draw it forward. So this big metal spring here is what gets pushed up, and that lets, it's holding the trigger bar down normally. All right. And yeah, we're not going to get a good view of that sear system quite yet. And to be honest, it looks like my sear spring might be a little monkeyed up. It was really amateur hour last time I took this apart. So let's see how much of this we can get apart. The safety has two little roll pins holding it in. Is the trigger going to clear without those? Hard to tell. Not even sure I want to take these bits apart, but let's just work our way from the front to the back and see how it goes. Again, make sure that's the serrated side of the pin that's coming out, so that we're not pushing the serrations through the firearm. And now I'm going to take a second look to see what's going to come flying out. Once this pin is out, I think we're going to lose a couple parts at once maybe. This metal piece, that spring will be free to kick it out of the way. And the plastic one there, actually that plastic one's still going to intercept it, which means I think it might be smarter to take this one out to relieve that spring pressure before we take the other one all the way out. So let's go ahead and do that too. And again, from the looks of this one, it is a serrated pin, but the serrations are on the other side, so either I put it in backwards or something, but let's see. Sure enough. So if you have one that you haven't destroyed like I have on this one by taking it apart before I knew exactly what it was doing, I would say just use the pin as a guide. If it's going in, you know, from that side and the serrations are on the right, then keep them on the right. If they're on the left, keep them on the left. So now that this is out, I can let that spring come out. The spring itself will lift out. Now the spring was not going through. The spring is just pushed under those other parts, and then it actually was pushing up like this on the big piece. So now that there's no spring pressure, this one will come out nice and friendly, like. And I think if we compare these, we should find that it should be more or less identical, all the serrated ones. And now that that's out, this piece should lift out, and it does. Stick this through it just so we remember where it went. And then this, I'm thinking, will rotate and then pop through the polymer there. And you can basically, see how these guys engaged. When this is forward, then this can't move down. When you push it into the back position, now it's got some wiggle room. And if you keep pushing it back, then this part's going to draw on this side and actually cam it down all the way. So that's the takedown mechanism. That wasn't so bad. Now, this is kind of interesting. The trigger bar does have this floating pin in it, and I'm wondering if I start the trigger pin out, will that give us enough room to get the thing out without the safety? I'm going to try that. We may have to remove the safety first, just not sure yet. And again, this time I think I was consistent. Oops, let's not hit the light. Yeah, the serrated on the left. And again, another pin that's identical to the previous ones. Alright, so I'm going to hang on to this trigger as I pull this out, because that pin, that spring rather, is fairly stiff here. But let's see, will it give me enough room to take it all the way out yet? I think the answer to that is not quite. So there's several questions I'm kind of wondering to myself as I do this. One, the safety is also that big leaf spring that is the magazine spring that's holding the trigger bar down. The other end of that up here is tucked under the safety, so it's probably what's giving us that snap in our safety. But I also suspect that if the safety were out of the way, then this could come out and then the trigger bar could come out. So I'm thinking that safety's just got to go somehow. And what's puzzling me is that these two roll pins are kind of in the way. So it's possible that there is actually a hole underneath the safety there, drilled into the plastic if we're really lucky, and then the design is for you to just push the roll pin all the way through. And if not, then we're going to make this much harder in a minute. Actually, it looks like there is a spring and detent on that side. I'm just going to get a little light under there. I may have created another problem for myself because that pin is pushed in. At that point, it could be preventing us from rotating it. Like maybe the safety should be able to continue rotating past this point. No, that's being blocked by rotation by the angle. That the safety itself is cut. Let's see, the pin on this side would run into that spring if I pushed on it. Well, they had to leave us some way to get the damn thing out. Question is what? I thought they would have drilled us a blind hole under there so that we could just drive that pin all the way down into the body. But they may want us to actually get in there and push that plunger down somehow so that we can rotate the safety all the way up. But there is scant little room in there for that to happen. What were they thinking? I'm gonna try this just a moment. Pretty sure I'm bottoming that out, so don't do that. It's not helping. So what could we get under there? If we could get something under there to push that down. Whew. There is not a lot of room to play with this. What I'm going to do, I'm going to leave that for a minute just to see if we can free it up when we get back into the rest of that. And so I'm going to focus on the correct technique for getting these pins in the back out. Now, I mentioned that there is, in between the slide release here And this piece of metal, there is a tiny spring sticking up there. I'm going to use the back side of my X-Acto knife. It should be just thick enough to get under that spring and lift it up, at which point I should be able to start the pin out. Now that the pin is started, should be able to safely get it going the rest of the way. And you can see that groove there that was holding that pin in. And that, if we had just hit that, it would have been game over. Now that that pin is free, the other part is back here, and it's similarly holding it in, but we can now push down on this one, and that should have, if I'm not mistaken, actually no, there we go, the whole thing can come out now. So we can get this spring out. There. Oh, that is the retention mechanism. So that funky pin, this leg was sitting on it like that, preventing it from moving left or right, and the back leg, this big hook, was hooked right over another similar pin. It's this one all the way in the back. Of course, now everybody's starting to move a bit here because there's no more spring tension. But again, these pins, notice no hammer pressure to get these guys out. They just drift right out because they're not wedged into the plastic, they're retained by the pin. And now, let's see, I think that will come out afterwards. This whole thing should come out. Question is will it explode when it does so? Not too bad. So you can see an awful lot of crazy wound springs kind of all over the place here, making this thing go. And that is just the way they built it. So everything does line up and kind of make sense, but you want to pay attention to the order that these springs are on and their position and orientation, because it's pretty messed up in here. And remember that this is your whole hammer spring, so this is our hammer under full power right now. So if you want to see what's going on, this little hook here, that's your sear coming over the top of the hammer. And the this down here is the bottom of that. That's where the trigger bar, in all likelihood, is going to do its business. This is the firing pin safety activator. So basically, if this gets pulled forward, that will be lifting that hook off the hammer and letting it come forward. Now I'm going to try and do this without breaking off all my fingers, and gently lowering the hammer to take some of that tension off. And now that I've done that, I'm just going to set the whole block aside for a second, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. And what I want to do now is look at the rest of these pieces to see what we can and can't do to see how these guys are actually attached. Now this guy, I think he is just pressed into the plastic. I don't think there's a pin holding him in or anything. So I think you can just work this away gently, and it will come out of the plastic. Yep. And so, again, this is a maneuver you don't want to do a ton of times, or this is going to start to get, looser and looser. So that was just pressed into the plastic. So this is essentially just pushed on from the outside. And the trigger bar itself, this is what I was hoping we'd be able to do, is, let's see, trigger bar. Since we've got the trigger pin out, we know we can manipulate this guy a little bit. We're still caught essentially on the magazine spring, and the trigger bar can't go any further back. It can go forward, but really can't go back. So the question is does that give us any leverage to get the thing out? So I don't want to release that trigger spring in this particular position because it's going to be a bear to get back. And the real tricky bit is that the trigger bar, it's under the magazine, safety spring. Oh, there we go. We are able to manipulate that just enough. Okay. Now the question is will that safety ever give us enough room to get this out? And I'm going to say that it doesn't matter now, because now we can at least take this tension off and not worry about it, because we can see the position that spring needs to be in. So I'm going to take the trigger bar off, take the spring off, and ta-da, just like that. So now we can see how that whole thing went. Whoops. I think I was just a little bit overzealous there. The trigger bar goes on the inside. And so that spring sits under that. This little leg of the trigger bar is going to push down. So this is not only the trigger return spring, but it's also what lifts this up as far as possible once that magazine safety is out of the way. And we'll get into the exact connections between this and the sear system in just a couple minutes. What I was hoping for at this point would be that we could maybe get enough light in there to see what our options are on this darn safety. Think, in theory, if I can get something small enough in there, oof, that is a tiny, tiny little place. I was going to try and push down on the detent. So if I hadn't monkeyed it up last time I was doing this would have probably been much easier, because now we can get one side or the other of this to an angle where we can get that roll pin all the way out. At least I think so. Good Lord. Oh, did I take that off camera when I did that? Ah, sorry, folks. So what I did was the left side, or right side of the gun, had a little more real estate to get a roll pin punch through. And so we've taken the roll pin off of the right side. Now, what I was hoping would happen at that point, while I'm in here, I'm gonna level out this roll pin, because I think the fact that it's uneven is causing me some of the problems in disassembly here. So while I've got this available, I'm gonna tap him in a few times. And I need a much better angle than that, or that's not going to work. So first, let's set the roll pin somewhere where I'm not going to lose it. And drive that one back. Now, this side is now free spinning, which means I should also hopefully be able to rotate it out of the firearm since it's no longer roll pinned in place. And I was correct. And so now, in theory, the whole mechanism should be able to slide out the other side of the gun. And I've got to still get the detent pushed down to get it past all of its bits. And I'm going to put a finger over that so that I don't go launching the detent halfway across the city. I've already had an unfortunate detent incident today. I don't need a second one. Alrighty then. Oops. There we go. Oh Lord, that detent is obnoxious. Everything's coming up detent. There we go. Almost lost him too. Oh, okay. So now what we're going to be able to do is see if there was a smarter way to do that. And I believe the answer is possibly not. We'll find out getting it back in. So there's that detent and spring. And the reason that we can only move it between the two positions, safe and fire, and not all the way around normally, is these grooves in there. It'll pop over that middle groove, but it's way too steep to get around the side. And so the trick to getting it out is, well, what I managed to do is get a very small tool in far enough to push the detent down so I could get it all the way around, which gave me access to one of the roll pins so I could push it all the way out. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stick it back in there without, Mr. Roll Pin being in the way, and try and see if there's some wiser method that would have let us get that out without quite so much rocket science. And I'm thinking a couple things. Let's see. I think the key might be in how this spring works. Yeah. So this guy, yeah, this guy is our guy. This spring is the magazine safety. That's where the magazine comes and pushes up, and then this tail end of it blocks the trigger bar. This end, when the trigger pin is out, this end can actually go down a little bit more, and I think that's going to be the key to this. Is that, let's see, safe, fire. No, that's not it either, because I was thinking that maybe with it in the down position, you would be able to drive this roll pin out straight down and push on it, but that's not it either. I'm not a smart man, Jenny. I think that's the ticket. I think that's the ticket. Yes. All right. Once all the guts are out back here, this can then be moved back. Once this is back now in the regular position, I've got all the clearance in the world to drive that roll pin all the way into the body of the gun. And so then that roll pin drops out, and then the whole rest of it comes out. Once that roll pin's out anyway, we'll be able to start sliding this straight off. The detent would pop up into this groove, but then we'd have room for it. So that's the ticket, is that this goes in after you've moved Mr. Safety Bar out of the way. So let's see, how does he come the rest of the way out of the gun? I think he just slides back all the way to there and then just comes out. Ta-da! And that's how he's shaped. So yeah, normally he's hooked onto that pin normally, and that's going to keep you from driving that roll pin out. But once you slide him back, now you've got a space down here for that roll pin to go. All right, living and learning. So we've got almost everything out but the magazine release, and I'm not sure if this is reversible or not. I suspect it is. So there's a horseshoe-shaped spring in here. There's a spring that goes in here or up here and down there, and then it's got a curve in it that goes into that dimple in the magazine down there. And so the question is, I think in this position, if we pulled it straight up, I think that curve would just ride right up along the inside. So we're going to give that the old college try and see if, sure enough, I'm not going to pull him all the way out because something tells me he's a little bit of a pain in the butt to get reseated. But my theory is that I could slide this out and spin it around, and if I pulled the spring out and flipped it around so that the little bumpy end was on this side, then I would have just done the Tutti Frutti Reversey, and yes, then I would have a magazine that worked from the other side. So, like I said, I don't want to take that spring out because I'm lazy. We've already had enough problems. So I'm going to push this in and slide him back down into place. Doop. Pops right in. Neat. All right, so setting the frame aside, we are going to study a little bit about all this stuff. We're going to try and see how our trigger bar does its job. So in this case, the pivot, the rotation of the trigger is around this pin going through the whole body of the gun, which means that when we pull the trigger, we're actually bringing the trigger bar forward. So that's the only real piece of information we need to go about figuring out how everything else works. We're going to take the trigger bar out and just keep in mind that simple fact that the trigger bar does its thing when moving forward. So let's look at all of the various things that the trigger bar can engage. Now this is another thing, because of the angles of these springs. If the body of the gun isn't here to hold them in, you gotta do that manually. Don't think that this normally sits way wampus like that. It sits like that. So these are quite close in terms of depth. And let's see. A couple interesting things here. Like I said, I believe this is the firing pin safety activator, but it also looks like if it went back to here, it would limit how high the sear could come up. So I'm going to cock this again. I'm going to see what's going on with that. If this is back, can the gun still fire? And I think the answer is yes. That was just an optical illusion. So if that's all the way back here, does that ever actually interfere with the sear? I believe the answer is no. Even with that back there, sear has plenty of room. Okay. So then all we have to do is holding it like this. Something. I lost track of what this pushes on. I wonder if that's a piece of the frame. That sits in there. Yeah, okay. So I couldn't figure out where my sear tension came from because this spring is a little bit floppy, and the answer is that the back of the frame is it is going to push that up, and that's what's going to push the sear wanting to always come down, meaning that our trigger has to overcome that. So this is where it's going to sit normally. And now our trigger. So we know that the magazine safety holds the trigger down. So presumably when it's able to lift up, it's going to do its other functions. And I think it's pretty straightforward. These two little legs, this first one is in charge of operating the firing pin safety. So first thing it'll do is lift the safety up into the activated position so the hammer or the firing pin will be able to move. And then after that's up far enough, or roughly at the same time probably actually, it's going to grab the sear and pull the sear back. So it's operating. These two little legs are basically both moving it at the same time. So they are very close in timing. Both legs getting moved. And then the disconnect is the slide's going to knock this piece back down when the slide cycles, which will cause these guys to drop and clear. So it's not going to, from the looks of it, the reason that the firing pin safety is long is that it wants to be able to drop off of the sear without necessarily dropping off of the firing pin safety, which is kind of interesting. So it looks like it always wants to engage with the firing pin safety, but only when it's up high enough can it engage with the sear as well. So disconnect lets the sear come back so it catches the hammer during cocking. Nifty. And again, I keep saying again, I don't know why. This big old spring that is the magazine safety, it basically just catches the edge of this, so that, but it does flex around the midpoint. So if there's a magazine, the magazine will push this spring up. so that it's no longer holding the whole thing down. So when there's a magazine in there, this gets lifted up so the whole thing can come up high enough to engage. When the magazine comes out, this spring basically just holds the trigger in that disconnected position. And because it goes over the pin right here, that keeps it from going too far forward or backwards, and keeps it always in the right place at the very edge there. So if we wanted to further disassemble this, there's some interesting bits. That hammer is under an awful lot of force. I think we could probably get the sear out without killing ourselves. So the sear spring is on it, a kind of interesting angle. If you notice, it's got a leg that's turned and bent in there. So I think if we want to get the sear spring off, we would have to get those coils to come out first. To give us enough real estate to rotate that guy later. Oh, no. That's Dan being stupid. I'm wrong. I'm so wrong. All right. A smart person would have said, this pin is our trick. And there's actually two systems here. Yeah. All right. So what I'm going to do is first I'm just going to pop the firing pin safety spring over and off to the outside, and I believe now this whole piece can be lifted out. And now, since the hammer is forward, I have access to the back side of that pin, and so I can pull the sear pin out. The sear spring, if we actually, the whole thing should rotate off now, I think. It doesn't get hung up on nothing. And if we want to get the spring off now we can rotate the spring to line up with that notch. So it goes in and then rotates. So this spring really can't fall off. It looks like it could fall off pretty easily, but in fact it's kind of twisted in place pretty well, and there's only one way to get it on or off, and that's to have the pin out of the way so you can rotate the whole spring. I think if you tried to get this off while that pin was still in there, you'd probably do a pretty significant amount of damage to the spring, so don't do that. And that itty bitty hook right there, that's your sear. That's it. That's what's holding on to the hammer. And the hammer, I'm a little nervous about this because realistically I don't know how the hell I would get this back on because of the amount of force that spring is under. So I'm inclined to not push my luck. I suspect that it's designed so that you can lever it into place a little bit. This front part of the hammer is more than just adding mass, I suspect. Notably, since the sear is only grabbing it right here, you see that wear. That's not much of a sear surface. It's also not very smooth. So I would hate to polish this because I suspect it's case hardened, which would mean we'd be weakening it. I mean, it's already worn past a little bit of it, so I would say use caution if you want to monkey with that. So if I did drive this pin out, that spring is it's hefty. That's a lot of hammer force. So much so that it looks like they even put a little roller bearing. Yeah. So the rather than just push up on the hammer, there's actually a little bearing here that's the right width to line up with the leg of the spring. So that's really the question, is that, if you were just pushing this in by hand, would you be able to get enough pressure on it? Whew. Should we find out? I don't think I want to find out. But what happens? There's two possibilities. One is, if this little pin comes out, then you might only have to get the hammer in place while you're doing the little pin. Does the little pin move? Oh, it does. So maybe that's the secret. You put the hammer in just fine, and then you use a punch or something to lever the little one over. Let's try that. I'm going to push the little pin out, and sure enough, as soon as we push it out a little bit, that hammer pin, that's pushing on it fairly mightily. But my theory here is that I would be able to take a screwdriver and push hard enough against that. Ow! I just stabbed myself with the ejector. Probably a screwdriver that's been specifically modified to hold that pin out of the way would work better. But since I don't have that right now, I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. Yeah. So it doesn't... It's just a really stiff spring. It's not overwound a bunch of times. So you don't have to go super far there. So once that's out, the larger of the two pins that's holding the spring itself will come out. The spring itself, the big pin, and the entire freaking hammer. And that pin is press fitted around that bearing. I don't see any burning need to try and take the bearing out. I mean, if it were a free floating pin, maybe I would, but you'd have to hammer that out pretty hard, because you can see this again, it's a serrated edge pin. I don't want to monkey with that little tiny bearing. We'll put a drop of oil on it while I put it back together, just because it seems like something which should move freely. If we think it should be moving freely, then we put a drop of oil on it. And everybody's happy. Now, let's take a look at this guy. Are you symmetrical? I think you are. Now, we'll be pushing on one side a little harder than the other because we're putting it under pressure to put it back in. So I want to make sure that this doesn't get marred up on the side that's going to go against that roller bearing, because that would not help us. It's pretty clean. Oh, there you have it. So, now of course, remembering which hole is which is always going to be fun. An awful lot of holes in this thing. I'm going to go ahead and start that pin from the side. And now there is a little cutout on the one leg, so if you somehow forget which way these pins go in, they really only go in one way, and that's the way that's going to leave room for their head to stay recessed. If they came in on this side, then that would be sticking way out, and that would not work well. So this one's going to come in from this side, and the whole challenge will be to just get that piece far enough down, long enough for us to get this pin pushed past it. Like that. Not the smartest thing I've ever done in my life, but you know, just in case you took yours out, now you can say, well, now you've at least been shown how it goes back in. Now I'm going to pop my big old sear pin out again and slide the sear back in. So our sear is in place. You want to make sure you got it in the right hole, then you can always cock the hammer and pop the sear over the edge. If it's in the wrong hole, sear's not going to be able to grab it. So we've got our sear in the right place. And for this one, you want to make sure that the spring is locked under the little tiny leg there. Otherwise it's going to slip all over the place on us. And that one just goes in here. And then once he's in there, what we want to do is take the itty bitty leg, make sure it's under that part, and then we're going to lift this guy up. Whoops. We want to bring him all the way over, and he's going to go. You've got the sear spring, and you want this leg to go behind the coil of the sear spring, and that way when they're all laying flat, that actually lines up. Everybody is perfectly lined up at that point. It just looks kind of funny if this guy drifts around a little bit. And then the last hole is the actual pin that's holding the whole thing together there in the gun. Alright, so reassembly. I need to take a drink here. Hang on, guys. I gotta think about order O operations. So we that magazine safety the safety goes in, and everything else is pretty much built around that. So I'm gonna start our little detent and spring in its hole. Oops, stuck under my damn nail. And it doesn't look like there's any good way to do this, so I'm going to try and do it on the way that's going to involve us having to poke this the fewest number of times. So as we get it, to each step, we should be able to walk past a little bit more of the detent at each level. Until it's all the way in. So we safety. And now put this guy on from the other side. And I'm going to use my same roll pin punch to make sure that hole is in fact all the way lined up. And then I'm going to actually try and get the roll pin in there. Now there's another set of roll pin punches in the universe that actually is it goes outside the roll pin to hold it in place while you it basically holds the roll pin like a cup, so the roll pin goes into the punch. If you don't have those, highly recommend them. They make starting ones like this a lot easier. I have a set, I just don't know what I did with it. So when I push this in, I do want to be careful not to push it really any past flush. It doesn't need it. As long as it's in there, it's going to hold everything together. Now somewhere I have that big old magazine safety. Where did it get to? Come on, YouTube, hook me up. Where'd it go? Gremlins in my shop. Seriously? Workspace ain't that big. I feel like hiding under the trigger bar itself. Go figure. So if I recall, if we have this all the way at the back, that should be enough room to get it started. Make sure it's between the pieces of plastic here, because that's holding it in there. And then we're gonna slide it all the way up in place, and it will slide up. You can either push it from the back or the front. It doesn't really matter. It's gonna go all the way up, and we know that the pin that's gonna hold the trigger will also be holding that. So we can also slide this in and make sure that we're perfectly aligned. Yeah, so that just made sure I had clearance. And I think the trigger bar has to go in, the trigger and trigger bar need to go in next, and then the guts. Because the guts are going to drop down, and I won't be able to get this in past them. So definitely trigger bar and trigger in there next. And I believe that we can also There we go. Sorry, I couldn't remember how that went. Yes, the only one way it's gonna go. So, as you saw me work it out, same thing. So now, you know what? I just did all that and realized that the trigger came in from the bottom, not the other way around. My bad. So set all this apart for just a second, and we're going to get our trigger come up all this way, and it will come up far enough that we can easily manipulate everything, so it's not a big deal here. Get this guy started just a little bit, get the spring on there. And then pull it back. Oops. Let's try that again. I think I'm going to be clever and actually put this in correctly the first time rather than doing it 3 times. So what I did wrong just there was I didn't make sure that the long leg was actually going to be behind the trigger surface down there. I had it on the other side of the trigger. So now with this one in place, trigger bar, oh, work it. Ta-da! All right. And we're going to take one of our pins. We're going to line this guy up. We're going to work through. We're going to make sure that he's gotten past everybody he needs to get past. And we're going to make sure that he also can get under Mr. Magazine Safety. So to do that, I'm going to come in here and lift up the magazine safety just a little bit and then move the trigger forward. And yeah, that safety is really just long enough to do what it needs to do. And there's barely any wiggle room in there. So once we seat this pin, it'll stay there more solidly, but essentially you got to make sure that it's tucked under, the trigger bar is hooked under the magazine safety before we drive this the rest of the way in. And again, ta-da. Well, that wasn't supposed to happen. Or was it? I think it actually was okay to happen. Because, yeah, that's what it is. My failure to observe the obvious. If you notice, the trigger bar goes past that pinhole. So when this pin is actually in the gun, the trigger stops there, and then you've got far more engagement there. So with the pin in place, now your trigger is going to stop and it's not going anywhere. It's when you've taken that pin out that you actually finally get just enough room to bring the trigger bar past that with just a little manipulation to get it out of the gun. So that's what's going on there. So for now, we'll just make sure it's tucked under. And let's see, before, I think we want to get this back in there before we go too far. And the other thing I want to do is take a good hard look at this spring to make sure that we haven't misunderstood any of its things in the universe, because it's going to go over the back pin and hold the back pin, and then something's going to be pushing it down, and I believe that something is actually this piece. No. Yeah, they were between these two, right? If this was the pin, yeah. So this spring not only is the rear pin retention, the front pin retention, the loop in the middle there is actually, it's going to springboard off of both of those to provide the slide release tension as well. The multi-function little tiny spring. Alright, so anywho, which way was up on this? down, or was it like this, and we went up, down? I think that's how we did it. Again, just pressing the plastic on and trying not to do that any more times than we absolutely have to. Making sure those are going to be reachable. And trigger down. I'm going to put just a little bit of tension on the trigger when I put this assembly back in. Actually, I'm going to try something a little bit different. Technically, so this pin doesn't actually go through the block, like it can slide on like that, which means if we put this pin in the gun first, we should be able to actually seat this and rotate the rest of it down. I'm not positive that's going to work, but I think it will help us have just a little better control over our super fragile pin. So I'm going to put him in there, and then I'm going to, let's try that again. I'm going to put a little bit of downward force on that pin to get him to pop into place. Alright, so that's where he's locked. Now, the problem is, now this guy is way the hell down there. And that's too far down for us to actually work. So we're going to need him up till we're ready. Well, let's see what happens. Let's see if I can successfully hook him. Oh boy, so many parts to do at once. What I'm worried about is the sear spring itself. If I try and rotate that into place, is the sear spring going to actually connect? Oh, it looks like it is. Sure enough. So since this appears to be working, I'm going to make sure I get this pin started. Neat. Alright, so as we go, you got to remember a bunch of little things. One is this piece might kind of get in our way. The trigger is definitely going to get in the way, and then as the pin gets fatter, the pin itself is going to get in the way. So we got to have the trigger partially pulled as we do this, and then we're going to hit a point where it stops, but that's because of our retention pin is now just ever so slightly in our way. And because we're through this now, it's got pressure on it. So we go back for the X-Acto blade, and again we're gonna put a little, I'm gonna pull the trigger just a little bit so that the trigger pin, actually the trigger pin is now cleared just enough, So I should just have to get in here and lift him up, and then we should feel that guy snap into place, which means I shouldn't be able to push him too far in either direction. Double check the back one. Everybody's happy. And let's put our magazine in to defeat our magazine safety. And ta-da! So again, the disconnect is going to happen on the slide level, and it looks like it has to happen. Let's see. All right, so we pull the trigger, and then while the hammer is cocking, drop that off, and sure enough, there's the disconnect. So pull the trigger, come back, disconnect. Lets our oof, that's hard to emulate, but it is actually working. Thinking that maybe the disconnect has to be more aggressive for that to actually work. So the disconnect only happens. Gotta have a lot of things going on at once. The hammer has to be significantly further back for the disconnect to actually allow the sear to come forward. Alright, so the working bits are working. Let's see, safety prevents us from moving the trigger just like it's supposed to. And so now we've got to get takedown mechanism back in place so that we can take things down. Now, if you recall, once the spring was out, these guys went in without too much resistance. This guy came in and rotated downward, and his little buddy here just sat in place. And line up. So we can tap him in. Where'd my big punch go? Just had my favorite punch, now I moved it. There we go. I'm being more consistent this time, putting the serrated ones on the left each time. Again, pay attention to how yours was made and stick to that. That will minimize damage to the gun, because maximize the number of times you can successfully take it apart before it fails forever. This guy, we know that Mr. Springy here just slipped underneath all that stuff, and once he was under there, then we gotta get this and pull him back while we put in the last pin. And let's see. Yeah. So again, just holding that in place, it actually goes in pretty easy. And we should be able to tap him back. See, this is the one that I'm now double not second guessing myself. When I just disassembled it for us here, this was the one that actually had gone in from the other side. So if I push it into this side and it was never done that way before, I'll kind of be wallering out a big hole in the gun, but I'll be damned if I can figure it out. So we'll leave that as an exercise to the viewer. No, I'm wrong. All right, let's stop that before we do damage. Because this plastic piece snaps under this pin as part of its motion, that's the first thing that you're actually overcoming is you're snapping under that pin. So this little tiny leg back here has to be able to get underneath this pin. That means this has to be a smooth surface. That serrated edge is going to poke through here, and if you notice the wall of the gun over here, the polymer, more than an eighth of an inch thick. Over here, thin as anything. So I was mistaken. This one is in fact got the serrations coming in on the other side, and for good reason. That good reason being that that the gun is more substantial on that side, and that lets the smooth edge of the pin be free to operate under the gray plastic part. That makes sense. In other words, if we had put it in this way, those serrations would have been rubbing against this plastic piece and torn it to shreds, and it would never move smoothly. So this pin does in fact go in through the other side where there's full-on polymer everywhere to take that extra thickness. And so you can usually reason this stuff out, even on unusual firearms like this one. So now our takedown, it pops past there, and springy. Huh. Why does that feel like that should be under more spring pressure than it is? No, that's right, it can't go backwards because the plastic's in the way, and that's backwards that actually releases it. That's actually the locked position. Okay, sorry, just thinking myself through. Jeepers. We're out of parts, so we must be coming up to close to done. So I'm gonna put our barrel back in, make sure it's aligned in the front, take a little of the pressure off, line it up in the back. And in this case, we're just gonna set it on. The rails, by the way, don't the rails engage in the back only. There's no front rails, so that's this guy up here, and in the front it's held together by the barrel, and then the engagement between the barrel and the front of the gun. So when you're putting it together, it's only these little rails in back that you've got to get lined up, and if you get them lined up, it will assemble itself. So magazine safety, magazine release, bang. Check the disconnect. Solid disconnect once everything's there. I couldn't hold the hammer back far enough to pull that off. Safety, trigger safety, Safety when racked. That's when it's live. Bang. So, there she is. That's your 5-7. Hope you were entertained by me figuring out some of the stuff that I couldn't remember and all the mistakes I made before. Hopefully I got to you before you destroyed that infinitesimally small pin at the back that's retaining everything. And hope you learned something. Have fun. Stay safe. Uh-oh. Where did my stop button?